My name's Jeremy Weinstein, and I serve as the Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. Let me begin by thanking our co-sponsors for today's events, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Institute of Politics. This is my first Godkin lecture as Dean, and it's a privilege for us to host one of Harvard's most distinguished lecture series here at the Kennedy School. First established at Harvard in 1903, the lecture honors Edwin Godkin, a 19th century Irish-born American journalist who founded the political and cultural magazine The Nation and was editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Post. Charles William Eliot, then president of Harvard, introduced the inaugural Godkin lecture by praising Godkin's remarkable vigor and great candor and unremitting devotion to lofty ideals of public duty. The theme of this lecture series has been the essentials of free government and the duties of the citizen. And over the years, some of the nation's and the world's most distinguished public leaders have come to Harvard to deliver this lecture, including the former governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, the former president of MIT, Susan Hockfield, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, the social justice activist, Brian Stevenson, and just last year, the former president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. This year's lecture is particularly special because it will be delivered by an alumnus, Lee Hsien Loong, Senior Minister of Singapore and MPA class of 1980. Mr. Lee has put the lessons he learned at the Kennedy School into practice throughout his storied political career, as a member of Parliament, as a party leader, and as Prime Minister of Singapore from 2004 to 2024. We greatly look forward to hearing about his efforts to build national leadership and to strengthen political institutions in Singapore, leading the nation through crises like COVID-19 in just a minute. But first, I want to highlight something I know is a point of pride for both him and for us, which is the Kennedy School's special relationship with Singapore. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father, once wrote, "A nation is great not by its size alone. It is the will, the cohesion, the stamina, the discipline of its people, and the quality of their leaders, which ensure it an honorable place in history." Singapore has long emphasized the importance of leadership and invested in preparing a new generation of leaders with the skills that they need to govern. We are proud that so many of Singapore's leaders have come to the Kennedy School as part of this investment in Singapore's future. Its current president, prime minister, deputy prime minister, 3 of its senior ministers, its minister for trade and industry, all graduated from the Kennedy School. We count 330 Singaporeans among the ranks of our alums, and several more are in our student body today. Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy traces its origins to Harvard, which helped establish the country's first public policy program in 1992. Thankfully, we'll have the opportunity to grow even closer in the coming years because of a new academic collaboration between the National University of Singapore's East Asian Institute and our Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia. Over the coming years, these 2 institutes will collaborate on policy-oriented research that covers East Asia and the world's pressing social and political challenges, culminating in joint projects, publications, visiting fellowships, and an annual conference. Now for the formal introduction of our distinguished lecturer, I have the great pleasure of turning it over to my colleague, one of our former deans, the founding father of the modern Kennedy School, Graham Allison, the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thanks to the Senior Minister and former Prime Minister for taking time out of his busy world to be with us, and welcome Madam Ho as well, his wife, who's been a good friend of the school as well. So if you need a long introduction to our speaker today, you came to the wrong meeting. I think what's to be said is that we're extremely proud of what has to be an individual who is, I think, one of the most distinguished graduates of the school, a 1980 graduate as a Mason Fellow, and a person whose life and career exemplifies what we aspire to at the Kennedy School when we talk about training next generations of leadership. This report card that I did rather presumptuously when the Prime Minister stepped down last summer and became the senior minister was mainly for reminding Americans in the middle of an election, and the British, who constantly seem to be changing their government, that leadership matters, and that if one actually looks at the thing that citizens consume, like my per capita income, or my life expectancy, or inequality, or judicial system, or health care, or my safety, or infant mortality, while Americans assume we're always number one in everything, it ain't quite true. And actually, if a stork were delivering a baby today to a country, if the stork delivered the baby in Singapore, it would have 7 years longer life expectancy than an American. Well, what about that? So I would say to have the opportunity to have an individual from this community, whom I've had the good fortune to know for these now 4 decades plus, and to watch over these decades, tell us a little bit about not just what we would teach in leadership in a leadership course, but actually how achievements like these were achieved. As he always insists, all of governance is a work in progress. None is ever done and finished. Everything is fragile. But nonetheless, not just for 1 year or for one 4-year term or for a second term, but over literally 2 decades in which Americans have gone through 4 or 5 presidents, British through I don't know how many prime ministers. We can look at the government's results and say, it's probably something we can learn from this. So we're looking forward today for the lecture from our distinguished graduate, Senior Minister Lee.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dean of the Kennedy School, Professor Jeremy Weinstein, Professor Graham Allison, faculty and students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to deliver this year's Godkin Lecture. I'm delighted to be back here at Harvard Kennedy School, and it brings back to me warm memories of my year as a Mason Fellow, 1979, 1980, nearly half a century ago. I remember Professor Zeckhauser. I attended his course.
He's right over there.
Yes. And he's here this evening. And he once asked me, do you think your classmates know where Singapore is? So I boldly replied that I was sure people knew it was a small country in Southeast Asia. And perhaps I spoke too confidently at a time when mails were sometimes still being addressed to Singapore, China. But in the decades since then, Asia has prospered and Singapore has developed into an international financial and business hub. So today I'm a bit more confident that most people would have heard of Singapore. Last night we had dinner and we asked the waitress, do you know where Singapore is? And she said, it's a very, very long way away. So we make progress. And perhaps people have not only heard of us, but also have heard of how we've gone from third world to first in just 1 generation. And many people ask us, how did you manage this leap? How did Singapore build its national leadership and institutions, develop the economy, strengthen social and political cohesion, and secure itself internationally. And I tell them it's been the work of several generations of Singaporeans ever since the Second World War, 80 years ago. Crucially, right from the beginning, we set off down the right path. And fortunately, we were then able to stay on track to do things which worked for Singapore and therefore create a virtuous cycle and stay on track again. And let me start with this history and context before explaining some of the principles and practices that we have applied in governance and that have helped us to journey here. Today's Singapore may give the impression that the country has always been orderly and stable, but this was far from so. Our beginnings were turbulent. Like many other countries, we fought against our colonial masters, in our case Britain, for the right to determine our own destiny. And we eventually succeeded and achieved first self-government, which is internally, and then independence, full independence. Along the way, we had to choose whether to have a left-wing and pro-communist government or a democratic and non-communist government. It was a big political battle, especially as our population was majority ethnic Chinese and with strong ethnic and family ties to communist China. And fending off the communist threat was one of the reasons why Singapore merged into a new Federation of Malaysia. We saw that as our future, independent future. But in the Federation, we encountered another fundamental conflict of priorities between multiracialism and racial equality on the one hand, and race-based politics and the dominance of one ethnic group on the other hand. Tragically, this led to riots and bloodshed. The differences proved too stark to be reconciled, and in 1965, Singapore was expelled from the Federation. And so, independent Singapore was born. It was a complicated, unnatural birth amid great political upheaval and strife. The battles could easily have gone either way. But fortunately, in the end, things turned out well for Singapore, and these circumstances established the founding ideals that continue to underpin our nationhood: to be independent and sovereign, to be non-communist and democratic, to be multiracial and meritocratic, with equal opportunities for all, regardless of race, language, or religion. This path that we took to get here, that started with these three fierce struggles against colonialism, communism, and then communalism, was a crucial factor in Singapore's development. Because of this experience, that generation of leaders and citizens knew exactly what was at stake, and they were determined to knuckle down and turn vision into reality. And that's why, if others try to replicate our recipe, or even if we ourselves were to traverse all over again the same journey and hope to come here again, we may not end up in the same spot. So, first lesson is we are path dependent. The history matters. The second lesson is we paid close attention to building a high-quality government and high-quality institutions. We built up the public service. We kept government careers attractive and salaries competitive. We awarded scholarships to attract the best and brightest in each cohort of graduating students. Most critically, we created a strong public service ethos, instilling in our officers a sense of mission to serve Singapore to the best of their ability and to make the country succeed. We assembled a competent political leadership too. Some leaders excel at galvanizing and rousing the masses in the excitement and fervor of the independence struggle. Others are better at organizing the government and motivating the people year after year in the patient toil of nation building. Thankfully and exceptionally, our pioneer leaders were able to transition from one role to the other and succeeded in both. Ministers do have to get re-elected. But because in Singapore they are likely to get re-elected if they deliver results, they know the buck stops with them. Hence, they have every incentive not to kick the can down the road, but to deal seriously with difficult problems. And hence also, we were able to get the right combination of politics and policy, a combination that worked for Singapore. The whole system was organized on the basis of meritocracy to maximize the talent that we had. We emphasized the rule of law and built up an independent and impartial judiciary. Policies were encoded in law where practicable, so that the government could function transparently, rationally, and predictably at all levels. We zealously kept the system corruption-free and implemented rules to keep money out of politics and avoided political parties and leaders becoming beholden to political donors and lobbyists. These key moves early on in our nation-building journey enabled us to build effective and efficient state institutions and agencies that delivered high-quality public services while keeping the tax burden low. Over time, they also entrenched norms of behavior and expectations in our society for the government and its leaders to uphold. And it enabled us to do the things right on the economy, on social cohesion, on nation building, on setting foreign policy. The rest of what I have to say could be from a textbook. But to be able to implement the textbook, I think it is Singapore's experience, the path we traveled, which made it perhaps easier for us to do than for other countries. So let me talk about these policies. We put high priority on economic growth and development. Without growth, we wouldn't have had the resources to do all the good things that we aspired to. We adopted what was then a radical approach towards economic development. In an era when the conventional wisdom saw MNCs as evil exploiters of cheap labor, we welcomed MNCs as a power for good, which brought technology, created good jobs, and modernized our economy. When prevailing development models were based on import substitution and protection of domestic markets, we pursued export-led growth, minimized import restrictions, and forced ourselves to become internationally competitive. I remember when I came to be interviewed for the Mason program, my interviewer in HIID, don't know if it still exists, the Harvard Institute for International Development, asked me about this, and I said, well, we don't believe in the infant industry argument. The infants never grow up. We force them to go into the wide world from the beginning. And fortunately, it worked for Singapore, and it worked for me, and they accepted me as a Mason Fellow. Glenn Jenkins. We practiced free market principles without becoming purist or dogmatic. We believe that market forces were essential to allocate resources efficiently. Market forces were essential to allocate resources efficiently and generate the impetus for development and wealth creation. Well-functioning markets also provided the discipline and the incentive for our people to work hard and to do well. But we were neither completely laissez-faire nor free market fundamentalists. I don't know if you can call us freshwater economists, but we are not fully saltwater economists. The government played an active role. We developed a conducive pro-enterprise environment. We ensured free flows of trade, capital, and talent. We educated our people with marketable skills so that businesses could count on a skilled workforce. And we built up a strong labor movement that worked closely with employers and the government to improve the livelihoods and lives of workers and achieve win-win outcomes. We applied economic principles to social policies too. For example, controlling traffic congestion, pricing essentials like electricity and water, building public housing, designing welfare schemes, and even controlling access to casinos. The secret is to price it. Where the private sector could not deliver the outcomes we needed, the government was quite prepared to intervene directly. For example, to develop industrial land, we set up a statutory board, Jurong Town Corporation, and it developed industrial land and infrastructure. To promote foreign direct investments, we didn't believe they would just come to us by themselves. We created a one-stop center, the Economic Development Board, which became a model for other countries. We even started companies, state-owned companies operating efficiently without subsidies and profitable. A multiple contradiction in terms, but they exist in Singapore. SIA, the Development Bank, DBS, Singapore Telecom, and several others. Fourth, we sought to build, beyond the economy, we also went into building a cohesive society and a strong nation, because we are not just an economy, we are a nation state. A small one, no doubt, but we have to build ourselves up as a society and as a country. So as the economy grew, we made heavy social investments to improve Singaporeans' lives. We built good education, healthcare, housing systems. 90% of our youths today leave school with post-secondary education qualifications. That means 12 years plus, probably 14, 15 years. And Singaporeans leave school ready to take up good, well-paying jobs, which are there and available for them. And so our youth unemployment rate is very low. We enjoy good health outcomes while keeping healthcare costs lower than most developed countries. 90% of Singaporeans own our own homes, mostly living in high-quality public housing. We also forged a national identity out of the polyglot immigrant communities that had made their home in Singapore. We made English our common working language. We kept Malay, which is the lingua franca of Southeast Asia, as our national language. And we kept Chinese and Tamil as two other official languages. So once a year, when the Prime Minister addresses the country and makes his major, essentially State of the Country address, we call it the National Day Rally, he has to make 3 different speeches. Speak in Malay, speak in Chinese, speak in English. And you can't say the same thing in all 3 languages. You have to make 3 different speeches, targeting 3 different audiences in their language, on their terms, to connect with them and to show that this is a multiracial country and we all have a place here. And then the main speech is in English, which is the language of none of our ancestors. We also introduced national service. All medically fit males serve either in the armed forces, the police, or the civil defense at the age of 18, instilling in citizens a sense of duty to defend the nation. We engage in considerable social engineering, influencing people's habits to foster values and norms that would work for Singapore. For example, we set ethnic quotas in public housing estates to keep our public housing estates ethnically integrated and to preempt the formation of ethnic enclaves before it reached the tipping point and cascaded out of control. All these strengthened our shared sense of identity, that we are all Singaporeans together, having more in common with one another than with ethnic Malays or ethnic Chinese or ethnic Indians elsewhere in the world. Finally, we pursued an active foreign policy, even as we provided for our security and defense. Small nations cannot determine the course of the world events, but we must not think that we have no agency. We make friends wherever we can, including with the major powers. We make common cause with like-minded countries. We build up our credibility and value by being a reliable, trustworthy partner that delivers on our commitments. We participate actively at multilateral institutions like the UN and the WTO. For example, we led the recent successful negotiations for an international agreement on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. It's a big mouthful, but in brief, you call it the BBNJ Treaty. And we chaired we presided over the sessions and helped bring it about. In a generation ago, one of our diplomats, Professor Tommy Koh, presided over the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea negotiations and helped to bring that about. And he worked with Jim Sabinius, who's a professor here, and whom I met this morning before coming in, and reminded me of this. We are also active in climate change discussions, which is an existential issue for a low-lying tropical island. An effective foreign policy must be based on strength at home. A nation will only be taken seriously internationally if it is cohesive and united internally, and its leaders and diplomats too. It must be able to defend and stand up for itself. Besides skillful diplomats, it must have soldiers who are willing to fight and die to defend the country. So we have invested steadily in our security and defense, building up a modest but credible armed force based on national service, as I explained earlier. But today's strategic environment is much more challenging. It is tricky to maintain friendships with countries that are not friends with each other. Everybody declares that they will not force you to choose sides, far from it. But everybody wants you to be on their side and not the others. So we do our best to take a consistent, principled position in line with our own long-term national interests. And when we have to disagree with other countries, we will be open and honest about it so that they can still trust us and they can understand that we are doing this because of Singapore calculations and not on behalf of somebody else. From our early years of nation building to modern Singapore today, for more than 60 years now, because the PAP took power before we became independent. Successive PAP governments have performed well and delivered on our promises. That's why Singaporeans have put their confidence in us term after term, 15 times in a row so far. This reservoir of confidence and trust widens the government's political and policy space, enables us to think long-term, and lets us make politically difficult but essential moves. For example, to raise consumption taxes to pay for the growing healthcare needs of an aging population, and to do so coming out from COVID-19. But we are careful never to take the people's support for granted. Nothing prevents Singaporeans from voting the ruling party out if we breach their trust, let them down, or fail to maintain the high standards that they have come to expect from us. Singaporean politics feels quite different from politics in many other countries. When I explain how it works in Singapore, they look at me as if I come from another world. But we have evolved and adapted our democratic political system and norms to suit our circumstances, and it has worked for Singapore. The country is successful. There's high trust in government and society. We have rising incomes and standards of living. We have high-quality public services, stable politics, a strong international reputation, and a united, resolute people who stand together against the odds. These assets have been built up over the long term, and during crisis, they prove their worth. For example, during the COVID pandemic, we were able to do the right things, enforcing safe distancing, treating COVID patients, vaccinating everyone, protecting jobs, maintaining confidence. We could only do so because people trusted the government, both the public service and the political leaders. And also people trusted one another, and our society was united. Hence, we came through COVID with relatively light casualties, livelihoods intact, and our social capital, public confidence, and trust all strengthened. And for that, we will long be thankful. But COVID will not be our last challenge. Existing problems never completely disappear and will keep coming back in different forms. That's the nature of government. You don't write a thesis, graduate, and then move on to the next research problem. The problem comes back in the same morphed form, but again, how do you survive? How do you earn a living? How do you upgrade standards? How do you meet expectations? How do you try to break the constraints and go beyond what seems to be imaginable? New challenges will arise too. Externally, great power rivalry and the breakdown of multilateralism will certainly mean fewer opportunities for growth and greater dangers of tension and conflict. Domestic issues like aging, social mobility, income inequality, immigrants and foreign workers, none can simply be waved away, especially in a slower growing, mature economy. Politically, the compact between the government and the population must be renewed in each generation so that fresh teams with fresh ideas can deal with fresh challenges. Thankfully, Singapore is in as good a position as any country to deal with these inescapable realities. The country's leaders at all levels feel a responsibility to keep our system working for as long as we can and beyond our own terms in office. As stewards, they seek out and induct new talent to renew their leadership roles, to renew their leadership ranks in order to have this responsibility handed on like an heirloom from generation to generation. So far, we've made 3 top leadership transitions successfully. This year, a new Prime Minister took over from me, and I'm very happy that the transition to Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has gone well. And I hope Singapore will continue renewing itself and rejuvenating our national project for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A great address and taking us into so many different arenas. I think when I look at the performance, I'm stunned for what's happened over these 20 years. And I look at the transition that's just occurring as you've handed the baton to Lawrence Wong, whom I'm proud to say is another former Mason Fellow and distinguished graduate of the Kennedy School. And so far, so good. But he performed very well in the previous jobs that he had had an opportunity to either perform in or not so well. And on the basis of his record, we're able to make a transition. So if we imagine, so Dean Weinstein is now having a strategic review here of the school as we think about our next stages in the future. And if you were offering a thought or two about how we would train next generations of leaders who were trying to produce a track record somewhat more like your own. Improvement in citizens' lives, improvement in citizens' incomes, improvement in citizens' safety, improvement in citizens' health, improvements in citizens' feeling about whether the society is going in the right direction or the wrong direction, cohesion, otherwise. So again, this would be a textbook. Maybe you'll write this textbook as your next assignment, but give us some of the headlines.
Well, first, focus on what you have been very good at doing, which is to understand, analyze policy options, policy implications, and ideas to do things better. How can government run better? I think you put a lot of emphasis on that. And I have found what I learned in the Kennedy School in those areas very valuable to me. I think beyond that, it would be very useful to have an understanding of how organizations work, how you can fit into a big organization, and how you can actually translate idealism and energy and ideas into actions and results. Lots of young people start off idealistically. They want to change the world. They think that things can be done better, and they are right. But when you go into an organization and you find that it's big and stodgy, and a lot of people are older than you, and a lot of people say they know more about it than you, and a lot of people have other thoughts and priorities than you, how are you going to fit in and be the change, as the slogan has it? It's quite hard. You need some patience, wisdom. Gray hair helps some, but too much gray hair is not, can be a problem. But to understand how such organizations can be made to work, I think is very useful. The governments often have many such organizations, in every government. I think thirdly, to understand the international environment, because the Kennedy School is not a school of foreign policy, but every country operates in an international environment, including the United States of America. And you need to know what the tensions are, what the interests are, what are transient, and you hope that will blow over with another administration or another foreign leader. What are long-term trends which have to be seriously dealt with and may need change of mindsets which are quite fundamental. And I think if we are going to go into government, that's another area which is important. The last area, which maybe is capstone, is you need to understand some politics. How do you get into a position where you are able to make things happen in the country? If the political leadership goes wrong, if you have a good civil service, it can keep going okay for quite a long time to come. If you never have had a good political leadership and you have a strong civil service, you can go okay as long as it's straight and level and you don't fly into a crisis. If you're in a crisis and you must switch off the autopilot and take hold of the controls, you have a problem. So actually, our model is that the political leadership has to understand what it is to govern. It's not just for you to make speeches. It's not just for you to be the PR face. It's not just for you to read the script which you have been drafted, write it, decide the content, set the direction, and make it happen. And how to get into such a political situation may or may not be possible in every country, but to understand how politics works and therefore how within that environment public officers can make a contribution, I think is important. Probably the most important of all.
Let me stay with that topic for a second, because I know that both you and your father before you were always a little reluctant to, quote, offer lessons or clues from Singapore. And you have often said this is a continuous journey in which you earn your keep every day and you are grateful for what's been accomplished, but you don't take anything for granted and you don't think anything is permanently accomplished. But still, if I remember when Nazarbayev became president of Kazakhstan, and for whatever reason, he asked me some thoughts about Kazakhstan. And I said, I would go try to talk to Lee Kuan Yew, your father.
Which he did.
When he was prime minister, which he ultimately did. And I would go study what happened there. In the case of Rwanda, I had a similar opportunity to have a conversation with Kagame early on when he began. I said, I would go talk to Singapore and see what happened in Singapore. So let's imagine, part of the fun that I did with this report card was an article last summer imagining that rather than just the two choices Americans had between the Republican and the Democrat, maybe we had a third choice, that we would subcontract the government to you for 4 years. Or maybe the British, as they go through their revolving door, say, well, why don't we see if we can get the senior minister to spend 4 years, running Britain and see how that works out. So if you were to go to Nicaragua or Guatemala or Tanzania or somewhere, tell us I mean, is there enough transference or enough possibility of adapting the lessons if one of our students goes back home to whichever country they've come from and decides, okay, we're going to make wherever as successful as Singapore?
Well, I think you can imagine that at different levels. If you want to, for example, if you want to design a pension system, we have one which is funded, which is solvent, which meets a range of needs: retirement, housing, healthcare, provides for longevity risks, and it doesn't sing and dance, but it meets the needs of 80% or more of our population. And then we have other schemes to top up for the rest. And if you want to design a pension system, well, you can look at ours and you can imagine how pieces of that can apply in your system. If you want to design a healthcare system, we have one. It's not fully government operated. There's a private hospital sector. The government part isn't operated as a department. There are hospitals which are non-profit but have to break even. There's choice, but at the same time we nudge you in certain directions and set certain public expectations and norms. And we are grappling with issues which you are too, for example, how to keep medical insurance under proper control, which is an insolvable problem. But you can study our experience and see what is doable in your system, I think, or housing, for example. But there are also unique things to Singapore. So that is one of the reasons why we hesitate to say that we have got your solution, because we don't necessarily even have our own solution for all time. So, for example, in housing, why were we able to do public housing which covers 90% of the population? Because when we started out, a lot of the land in Singapore was owned by the estates of wealthy people who had died, businessmen, traders from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And they had bought up big chunks of Singapore. In those days, the land was not so expensive. It had become their estates, and it was going to be tied up for so many generations until those lives and lives in being plus 21 years, as the legal term says. And the government says, no, we are going to develop the country. You are going to benefit. It's a windfall. We will take this, the country will benefit. We acquired the land, the government acquired large chunks of land from the estates. The dispossessed were not the poor. And therefore, because we had the land, we could plan, we could clear, we could build. And therefore, we could house the population. And you can't easily do that. I mean, in South Africa, for example, are you able to expropriate the whites? It is a completely different political situation. So you may or may not be able to do exactly what we have done, but this is how we have made our public housing work, and we hope that you will learn something from it. The politics level, I do not know that it is transferable. As I tried to explain, it has worked like this in Singapore because of the path we took. Because we'd gone through this fire and this crucible of fire. And that generation understood that our backs are to the wall, we will make this work. But more than that, there was one happenstance. After we became independent, the opposition, which was a left-wing opposition, decided that they would declare this a sham independence and they would boycott Parliament. And therefore, they vacated the seats, the PAP expanded, filled the whole space of politics, and therefore established dominance, which it has been able to keep and make use of to good purpose now for more than half a century. And I don't know that we will, if you start on a nation-building process, you'll have the good fortune to have such an outcome from big struggles, or to have an opponent which will make such a mistake.
Okay, well, I think the path dependency you and Zekauser and I were talking about last night, and I think that's a big lesson, so that there's not an easy transference with respect to that domain. Can we take you to COVID? So that for those that are interested, we'll have these slides up somewhere, but the COVID hit the world.
Yes.
So this is like a test for everybody. and Massachusetts is about the size of Singapore, roughly. We got a lot of coastline, and but if I look at the number of deaths from COVID between Singapore and Massachusetts, I pointed this out actually to Charlie Baker when he was the governor here. He didn't appreciate this very much. So tell us how Singapore dealt with COVID so much more successfully than Massachusetts.
Well, I don't have a specific comparison with Massachusetts, but I can tell you what we tried to do.
Yeah.
We saw it coming. We knew we couldn't avoid it. Because if you're at the end of the world, like New Zealand, they could close themselves off for quite a long time, and they get on pretty well, and it worked for quite a long time and it tided them over. They had time to get vaccinated and prepare. But we knew it was going to hit us soon, and we couldn't just shut ourselves down. Because we are a global hub, and if you shut yourself down, you constrict the economy. We will starve. So what do? So we watched, we calibrated, we set up a working committee which oversaw the process, and then Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, or rather then Minister Lawrence Wong, was put in charge of the committee and coordinated the ministry. So it's not a Ministry of Health problem, it's a national problem. Trade and industry, Ministry of Manpower for jobs, health, public health, your ministry responsible for community development because you have to get community activities organized. And we put all this together and oversaw it through a working committee which was multi-ministry, and everybody chipped in. Then we calibrated our response as we went along. Eventually, we had to have quite tight borders, but we tried hard to hold it off. I think in retrospect, we probably held it off a bit too long, and we probably should have been tighter a little bit earlier. But this is after the fact. We expected the bugs to come in. It did. In fact, I was in Davos, going home from Davos, when I got the message to say you got the first case. I said, not a surprise. Now let's get people prepared for this. And then we took it as it went on. We watched other people lock down. We said, do we have to lock down? And we watched the numbers. They wiggled up, they wiggled down. We said, as long as I can survive, I will try to hold off the lockdown as long as we can. After 2 months, the numbers started creeping up because people were coming home, we were quarantining them, but there were leaks. And in particular, it leaked into the foreign worker dormitories. And that worried us a lot because it's a communal living, and if it spreads in the dormitories, that's one thing. If it then comes out from the dormitories into the population unvaccinated and vulnerable, and many of them aged, that's a big problem. We watch the trends every day, the numbers. Tick up today, somebody will tell you, that's because we work extra hard to catch the bugs. Tomorrow the numbers will go down. After 3 days of times 1.5, times 1.5, times 1.5, I said, we don't believe this. You better move. They said, we haven't reached 100 cases a day yet. I said, I'm not waiting. So we closed down. Fortunately, after 2 months, we got the situation in the dorms under the control. We got the situation in the general public, in the population under control. We reopened schools, reopened jobs. We kept safe distancing going for a long time more. And because people trusted us, and we said, please, no visitors or no more than so many in the public eating places, or for some time the public eating places were closed. They generally complied, and it helped to slow the bug down. Meanwhile, we said, let's get ready for vaccinations. It doesn't exist, but the vaccines will come. The first in line will not be me, because the US, the Europeans, those who make it will make sure they are first in line, but I will not be last in the queue. So book the vaccines, book multiple. over-insure. Some may fail, some may work, but be there and make sure you have the access. And we booked the vaccines. I think we started talking about this in April, May 2020. The vaccines became available to everybody's astonishment within a few months. And by the end of the year, we had the first vaccines and we were starting to vaccinate our population. And fortunately, we queued them. So he said old folks first, vulnerable ones first responders first, then by age group, take your time. We don't have a crisis because numbers are under control. And first in line was me on television. I had every confidence it was a good vaccine. It worked for me. It worked as a gesture. And people came willingly. There was no fear. We had some anti-vaxxers. Fortunately, we were able to keep their numbers down and effectively rebut them. And we were able to tide over until enough of our people were vaccinated so that by the time Omicron came and overwhelmed all efforts to shut down, we were in a stable position and we could open up. The key thing is not that nobody died, because that's impossible, or the economy wasn't affected, that's also impossible. But that we were able to manage it so that you didn't lose your jobs. I had resources to keep your pay going when your employer couldn't pay you. You didn't go to hospital and find no oxygen and no bed. You didn't have to scramble from place to place with a tube looking to top up patient gasping, dying. You didn't have to queue up to be cremated like happens in some places. And we came through minus a trauma for which thanks be to the Lord. So at the end of this, we came out. I think it's a great relief. We wrote a white paper analyzing what we could have done better, sooner, cheaper, more effectively. We published it, we debated it, preparing for the next pandemic, which one day will come, and we watch every new bug carefully. And we publish it online, so if you're interested, you can find it somewhere on the internet.
It's a very good read, and it's also the extent to which your government maintained the confidence of your citizens about the ways in which you explained it and sustained confidence, put you in a much better position for the next round. But we have only about a dozen students eager to ask questions. Let me start with this gentleman. Please introduce yourself briefly and a short question.
Absolutely. Dwight Hutchins, Kennedy School, mid-career from 96. PM Lee, thank you so much. And thank you. My wife and I spent a decade in Singapore. We just left a year ago, so we lived through COVID. And a couple of things struck us. One was that, indeed, all of the ministers that you had across were super competent and super into the details of their ministries and running them like clockwork. So that was really impressive, the depth and the partnership with the American business community. I was the chairman of the American Chamber, and the partnership there that grew FDI. You could feel that the country was united in that sense. But what I saw and what we saw with COVID was you taking the leadership, taking the first jab, being on television every night, explaining to the people what was going on. And the taxi drivers to everyone on the street was listening to your every word. And it was impressive. And I think that you digging deep into saying we're going to protect our elders first and foremost, created a sense of national unity that, as we just went through an election, we questioned. And it was curious, how did your country take, like you said, people from very different cultures and bring them together and make them Singaporean? I mean, when we were there when Lee Kuan Yew died, and someone commented that it must feel like when George Washington died.
Sorry, can you make it shorter?
So what would it be? What did you do?
Good.
What did the country do to create this cohesiveness?
Good.
We spent a long time doing this. partly is policies. We made sure that lives improved for all, that there's not just a prosperous economy, but jobs which were good jobs for a wide range of the population. We educated people and tried to imbue them with some sense of values and what used to be called civic education, but an understanding of where Singapore fits in with the world. It's partly going through crisis together, and we've been through several in our half century, whether it's oil shocks, whether it's Asian financial crisis, whether it's the global financial crisis more recently, or a decade ago, SARS. Those not in Asia might have forgotten, but SARS was another COVID virus which hit us in 2003. And so there's a foundation of confidence and trust and mutual obligation between the government and the public, which you have to build on in a crisis. You have to be there. When in February 2020, as the cases started to grow, I happened to be having my National Day, my Chinese New Year's Day dinner with community leaders, 1,000 of them at the government house. And that evening, they were about to listen to me, but they were spreading amongst themselves WhatsApp photos of toilet rolls disappearing from supermarket shelves. There was a panic because people were not sure what was going to happen. Are you going to lock down? What are we going to be short of? Rice, toilet paper, food, everything. So I was about to speak to this. These are the community leaders, our people on the ground who have to help us hold the ground. And I told them, don't worry, we will take care of this. There will be food, there will be supplies. You will not have to eat Army C rations. And tomorrow I'm going to broadcast to the nation and explain to them what's coming to the extent that we know and how we must prepare ourselves. So the next day I made a broadcast. I didn't speak every day, otherwise people will stop listening to me. But I made over 3 years about 20 broadcasts, probably less than that, at critical moments to reassure people that we are there for you, this is what we know, this is what the risks are, this is what we have to do together. And one of the most telling broadcasts was when we locked down, and I had to say, don't worry, you will be safe and we will take care of all of you, including all the workers in the foreign worker dorms. It made a big impact on them. I think it made a big impact on their parents and families back home in India, in Bangladesh, in China, all the places they came from. It was not so obvious that it was going to be deliverable, but it was something which we had to try our best to do, which we did.
Which you did. Yeah. Please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Teresa He, and I'm part of the MPID program, class of 2026. So my question is more about promoting versus regulating innovative industry. For example, Singapore is one of the first country promoting and formulating cryptocurrency policy.
No, we are not promoting cryptocurrencies. That is a complete misunderstanding.
Regulating crypto policy and actually invest as a government. So I want to understand more about how do you form policy to make judgment as a country before there's a clear picture or evaluation system of the new industry?
Well, hopefully you are well advised by people who know more about it than you. Hopefully there are examples of how it has worked out elsewhere, and we can see which worked, which didn't, and we can follow them. For example, we did that with cigarette smoking. We scan the world. Every time somebody has a new and draconian measure, we say, how can we level up to them? So, warning messages, horrible photographs, plain packaging. And now people are talking about, generational bans, so that beyond a certain age, you will just stop smoking. And we will try and level up to them. Same with social media. But in an unfolding situation, in a crisis like COVID, You can have all the experts' advice, but you are operating in the fog of war. And you have to be prepared to make your own judgment based on incomplete information and contradictory advice. People will say it's safe, people will say it's not safe, people will say it's unproven. I need to do so many more controlled trials. By the time I finish them, I mean, the battle is over. So you do have to have an informed judgment and prepared to say, I have heard all this advice, this is what we will do, I'm taking responsibility. And for that, you need people who have seen crisis before and have some sense of what the issues are
And
in
just,
your team.
and just to be clear, in case there was any confusion, the senior minister is not an enthusiast for crypto. Please.
That's another subject.
I'm Jay Hong, a senior at the college. As a citizen, I just want to say thank you so much for what you've done for our country, and we're excited to see what you do next. As a young person, I think there's actually, not just in Singapore, but everywhere, there's a larger generational divide based off of different beliefs and normative issues. So I think what my Amma values is very different from what I value. What perspectives do you think young people are lacking nowadays? And how do you think young people can also try and bridge that conversation?
I think you are much more prepared for the new world than we are because it's a completely different set of challenges, and you are growing up attuned to them. I mean, you do not know a pre-internet age. And the future is going to be connected in one way or the other, despite bifurcation, despite people nearshoring, reshoring, and trying to disconnect chunks of the world. Even in North Korea, people get news somehow or other. So I think for the new world, the young will be growing up as digital natives, much more prepared for it than my generation can start to be now. We are trying our best not to be swamped and left behind and to keep up, but to be not just keeping up and ahead, you have to be a young person. What you do need to know is that certain things which your parents believe or your grandparents believe are actually true. And remain true. The world has completely changed, but race, language, and religion remain fundamental driving atavistic forces which are very powerful, that there are big countries and small countries, and Singapore is always going to be a small country, that we have different ways of making a living, but we will always have to make a living, and our neighbors will always be bigger neighbors than us, whom we will do our best to make friends with. I once had a visitor from, I think I can safely say this country, it's Mongolia, and he said to me that we have a law in our country that you are forbidden to change your geographical neighbors. I said, we have the same law. They've got Russia and China as their best friends. We have Indonesia and Malaysia as our nearest neighbors and good friends. And it is going to be like this for all time. We are different from them. They are different from us. We can benefit from them and they can benefit from us. But there are also differences in perspectives which are quite deep-seated because we're just strategically in a different situation. And we have to be able to manage them. And I think young people particularly have to understand this. It is not so easy. It's not so easy to do and it's not so easy to understand. So every few years, we have a panel on how we can do things better, and somebody will say, why don't we work harder to make friends? And I say, yes, we will continue to work very hard to make friends and continue to work harder. But this is a challenge which is one of those which I talked about, how to get along and hold our own while being able to maintain mutually beneficial relations with others whom we have to live with and who have to live with us. That's internationally. Domestically, I think you also have to understand that some laws cannot be repealed, particularly the laws of economics.
Good. Please.
Thank you, Senior Minister Lee, for speaking to us here at Harvard, as well as your leadership of Singapore. We have spoken on multiple occasions on how Singapore is compared to a Garden of Eden. And I noticed I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Benjamin, Singaporean, as well as an MBA student here at Harvard Business School. So you have described Singapore as a Garden of Eden. I was curious as to what strategic steps do you take during your term of government to ensure that we continue in this state, and for looking ahead for Singaporeans as well as for people looking to live in or partner Singapore, what are some of the things that you would encourage them to focus on to ensure that Singapore continues to grow?
Well, it depends mainly on us. I say Garden of Eden because it's a state where you are in, which once you have left, you cannot come back again. And I try to explain to you why where we are is highly path dependent, and dependent in particular on what happened in the first few years of our nation building journey. And because we have been able to build on that and maintain that, we have stayed in the Garden of Eden for more than one generation. If you go back to Genesis, that's kind of a contradiction in terms. But in Singapore, we have been in the Garden of Eden beyond Adam and Eve. And the way to stay there is to continue to have good government, continue to have good policies, continue to get new generations of capable and committed people into government to lead the population, and to have the population well looked after, at the same time understanding the realities of what our stability and prosperity depends on, and how we need to work together to keep it like this. Of course, you also have to understand that it is quite unusual for it to be like this. And if you break from this and you go to become a normal country, you will have the problems which normal countries have, and you cannot come back to where you are again, ever. And I've tried to do that. I think over 20 years, pursued all kinds of policies. I've brought in every election new teams of members of parliament, new potential ministers, tried them out. Some have stayed on, some have gone on to other illustrious careers, and kept the team up to date to the best of my ability, and been able to hand over country stable, in good order, to a team ready to take over. And now they have to do it and keep on doing it in the same way. But nothing is forever. Nobody can say, here's a formula and it will work for, never mind eternity, but even for the next 50 years. There's no such formula. But if you ask me, between buying insurance in case you fall out of the Garden of Eden and investing in this so that it continues to work well, I say don't spread your bets. Focus, make sure this works. We've done it before, and if you keep on making it working, all the troubles in the world, well, we can sit here. We won't be immune from them, but I think we can keep ourselves safe from them. Okay.
Unfortunately, we've come to the witching hour. I apologize for the many other questions that would have been asked. I think the proposition that Singapore has worked miraculously over these decades, and if I look to its future, if it were a stock and you were talking about buying it long or short, it would certainly be long Singapore. I'd say the leadership that's been chosen to take it to the next layer, including Lawrence Wong, whom the senior ministers mentioned, is somebody who's demonstrated also great capacity. So Singapore's been blessed with extraordinary leaders, both as the prime ministers and also in the government at many, many, many levels, and has had a degree of, I think, as you could hear from the senior minister's comments, determination and pragmatism that we could all aspire to. So let me just say we should all join in thanking and welcoming back, and looking forward to welcoming back many times one of our most distinguished graduates, Mr. Lee.
Thank you.
Straits Times did a great collection, which you can see online, called Keeping Singapore Special, on Minister Lee's 20 years. Good. Thank you. Great.